Good evening, friends. Once again, welcome. Uh, I'm happy to bring you another one of my small, short history talks. Um, it's been more than a week since I came on here, and so we've been having some other talks that I've been sharing. Um, this particular talk and the idea came to me. I, of course, have been reading a lot of Ghalib's works, and the idea for this talk really came to me from the fact that we lost a very, very special person yesterday, Mr. Ronald Vivian Smith. Many of you would know him. Those who were interested in the history, are interested in the history of Delhi, will remember him very fondly for all the stories and histories that he collected of the city. And I was just looking up what he said about. And he wrote several times about Ghalib also. And one of the columns that he wrote many books. He wrote columns in newspapers also. And one of the anecdotes or what a personal experience that he said, he used to go off and he used to explore these places. And he talked about going to Gali Qasim Jan, where um, Ghalib's Haveli is located. A lot of you may have visited there also. And he went there and he talks about, before he goes on to talk about Ghalib, he talks about his own experiences in that little lane because he goes there and what he talks to a few people and he talks about how people remember him. And some people are, he said some people were very dismissive that Ghalib was not a very religious person or he was not a very moral person, etc. So that was very typical of R.V. Smith because he brought history into the present. He talked to people. He collected stories, their stories, and he brought them to us. So a very, very special person, and I remember him, and I mourn his passing very deeply. But so this is dedicated to him. Um, Ghalib, a lot of people know about Ghalib, but he's also known but also misunderstood quite a lot. A lot of the stories about him, lot of the lot of the uh, lot of the work about him, a lot of the particularly the popular anecdotes about him, are actually sometimes a little unreliable. So let's look at, and being a historian by training, what happens is that we tend to look at things like personal records very, very carefully. And in the case of Ghalib, we are particularly lucky because we have two, at least for the period of 1857-58, the immediate during the revolt of 1857 and the years immediately after that, we have a very, very good source of information. And that is two things. One is a sort of a diary that he wrote in that period. This diary is called Dastambu. That is it was published with the intention of presenting to British officials. So we should not look at a very, shall we say, unbiased account. I mean, there were many things that he could not say in that particular work, but yeah, so he couldn't be critical of the British really. But apart from that, we can read a lot between the lines. Secondly, are his letters. He was a very, very prolific letter writer. And as soon as the postal system was badly disrupted during 1857, but as soon as it was restored, he began to correspond with his many, many correspondents around the country. And it's his letters which give us a whole lot of information about that period. So I'm going to talk about his experiences and his views of Delhi during the revolt. I think to understand that, we also need to look a little bit at Ghalib's own personal biography to understand the man better. He's, of course, a great poet, but who's the man? Who's the flesh and blood man who has various opinions and agendas and concerns? He was descended from Seljuk Turks, a family of Seljuk Turks, and they were from the area around Samarkand. And his grandfather had come to India in the 18th century as a mercenary soldier. Now, often when we talk of mercenary soldiers, we are talking about the Europeans who came to India. We are talking about Walter Reinhardt, we are talking about George Thomas, we are talking about Benoit and Perron and people like that. But it was not just Europeans. There were people from other parts, and particularly Central Asia. There were a number of people who came to Central Asia, from Central Asia to India at that point, because India, with the Mughal Empire crumbling and the uh, wars that began because of the sharp contests between different political military powers in India, there was a huge market for military prowess. So, um, Ghalib's grandfather, his Dada, uh, was also one of those people who came from Central Asia. He came, he and he had a so he came and joined. I think Ghalib himself is a little uncertain about exactly who all he. I'm sure he, like many others in his time, he would have shifted from one power to another, etc. But with it was during the time of Shah Alam. So mid 18th century is probably what it was. It may have been a little earlier also, but so Ghalib's father was somebody called Abdullah Khan, and Abdullah Khan also took the same profession, which was soldiering. And what he did was he for a while he served the Nawab of Awadh. For a while, he went off to Hyderabad. For a while, then he came back and he joined Nawab Ahmad Baksh Khan, who was again another mercenary. His father had also come from Central Asia, and they joined the Raja of Alwar. So they joined the Raja of Alwar, who was also a participant in this military struggle, and it's in time Abdullah Khan's brother, who was Ghalib's uncle, he also joined as Ahmad Baksh Khan and the Raja of Alwar. He also married the sister of Ahmad Baksh Khan. I'm sorry for all these convoluted background, but it does make a little bit of, it helps to understand some of the imperatives there. So what happened was that once in 1803, the British had really conquered quite a bit of the Doab, and particularly the area around Delhi they had conquered. And all these military powers around Delhi, they had entered into some sorts of treaties with them. And during those treaties, uh, the Raja of Alwar and Ahmad Baksh. Raja of Alwar, of course, was already was a Raja. He was a ruler over a principality. Ahmad Baksh Khan was given these large pieces of land. He was given territory also through an agreement with the British, and hence, and what happened was Abdullah Khan, Ghalib's grandfather, had died. He had actually been serving the Marathas, and when he died shortly after the end of the war, and his brother Nasrullah Khan, he died a few years later also. Now, Ghalib was very small. Ghalib was 5 years old when his father died. He was 8 years old when his uncle died. Nasrullah Khan, who had been married to Ahmad Baksh Khan's sister, he had been given lands also. So he was a small landholder. He was a small jagirdar. But when he died, Ahmad Baksh Khan entered into an agreement with the British to pay his heirs some certain sums of money as pension. And that was given to Ghalib. So Ghalib used to get this pension from Ahmad Baksh Khan. Later, again, very complicated, Ahmad Baksh Khan's son, Shamsuddin Khan, when he died, and all the lands were confiscated, that Jagir was confiscated, then Ghalib started getting his pension via the British government. So the reason I've given this background is that you look at this man, Ghalib has a pension which comes because of his father and uncle having cooperated with the British in conquering North India. And this is not to judge anybody. This is the context in which these contests are taking place. And so he gets this pension, and the British carry it on. The British also give him honors. So he's recognized as a Nawab. He's addressed in letters as a Nawab. He gets to attend the darbars. Now, these were not imperial darbars because there was no, British crown had no authority over India at that point, but it's the East India Company. So whenever the Governor General, for instance, comes from Calcutta to Delhi and holds a darbar, Ghalib gets to attend it. Or even if later, when the Lieutenant Governor of the Northwestern provinces at Agra, when he comes to Delhi and holds a darbar, or any other place also, Ghalib is invited. Ghalib he's not only invited, he's given some honors, and that is a khilat. Khilat is robes, a sarpech, what you put on your turban, a turban ornament. So these kind of things are given, which are symbols of high honor. So he has all these things which are given by the British. So now, where does his connection with the court come in? Now, with the Mughal court, his connection is actually later, because it is only by the late 1840s that he is introduced to the Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah. Shortly after Bahadur Shah's, not shortly after, but 1847, when Ghalib comes out from prison. He had been in prison for a little while for gambling, but that's another story. When he comes out, Bahadur Shah had a peer, Mia Kale, and Kale Sahab introduces Ghalib to the emperor. He starts going and visiting the emperor from time to time. Then Hakim Ehsanullah Khan, who is not only the Hakim or physician of Bahadur Shah, but he becomes a very powerful man and becomes the chief minister. He manages to get Ghalib the commission to write a history of the Mughal family. And that gives a huge advantage to Ghalib, because after a long time, now Ghalib, because of the Mughal emperor, now has 600 rupees a year. He's given this to write this history. So it's like a time thing. So you get 600 rupees as you do this. So he gets that. His pension from the British is 750 rupees a year. So that's what he's getting. Very soon after that, when he becomes the ustad, of the heir apparent, who is Mirza Fakhru. Then he becomes also as far as his poetry writing is concerned, he's not appointed by Bahadur Shah to write poetry. He's been appointed to write a history. And Bahadur Shah's ustad, his master in poetry, was Ibrahim Zauq. And when Zauq dies in, I think, 1853, or is it 1854, something like that, then Bahadur Shah asks Ghalib to become his ustad. So this connection with the fort actually comes really late. You would say almost in the 50s that he actually starts getting an allowance from the court. He becomes the ustad. So this is the connection. This is where Ghalib is placed politically, because the British, who are actually ruling Delhi, and the Mughal emperor, who's a great, he is a great cultural force, a very great social force, but not a great political force. That's where they are placed. And it's in this context that suddenly you have the outbreak of the revolt. Now, revolt, everybody knows the history. The soldiers mutinied in Meerut on the 10th of May, 1857. The next morning, they have arrived in Delhi. And in Delhi, they are joined not only by other soldiers, but a whole lot of other people. And very soon, the British are ousted, they are thrown out of the city, they are killed, and you have independent government that is set up. Now, that government that is set up, it's by the soldiers who go to Bahadur Shah and ask for leadership. And Bahadur Shah, of course, initially was a little reluctant to whether he should join them or not join them. But after a while, he realizes that he doesn't really have a choice, and the least he can do is to take some leadership, because that will at least control the soldiers to some extent. Because the soldiers were obviously at this stage, they don't have any their officers they have killed, they have mutinied, they have come here, they don't have any real leadership, to any binding force, and Bahadur Shah decides to serve as that binding force. Now, when you look at Ghalib's diary, this diary which is called Dastambu, this diary tells us something about how Ghalib saw the revolt. Now, as I said, he was writing for a British readership, so he could not be very, he had to be a little careful about what he said. But on the other hand, a lot of what he says is actually what a lot of other people also, there are many other sources through which we can study 1857 in Delhi, and it's sort of it's consistent with that. And what you find is that you have he talks about the soldiers very disparagingly, that these people who have overthrown all laws by rebelling against their officers, they've come to Delhi, they have it's not only but they have let loose this whole violence, because they have released prisoners from the jails, and they have also joined the rebellion, and the lower classes are rebelling against not only the British rulers, but they are now a force that is threatening the elite. Now, this I had talked about this in Chandni Chowk, so those who've read that book might be familiar with this. Now, this is something that Ghalib himself repeats also, that now we don't know, there was this, the noble-born people, the Sharif people, they are now very insecure, because their houses are being looted and all sorts of suspicion is being put on them, etc. And that really also later in some letters he talks about what his role is during this period. So from May 11th to about mid-September, the rebel government was kept on, and he talks about what his own role is. And he says that he used to he was not sympathetic with the soldiers. He says that Bahadur Shah Zafar himself was sort of actually helpless, almost a hostage to these soldiers. He couldn't do anything, because they did just what they pleased, and he had no choice but to just let them do what they wanted to do. And so he was really helpless. And he says that he himself, Ghalib, he says, I went to court from time to time. I was somebody whose job was to compose poetry. And I continued to do my job. I wrote some poetry. And in fact, there are some poems of his, some qasidas of his that were written and reported in the newspapers also. Qasida is a sort of an ode in praise of the emperor. So he wrote those, and so that was reported. So he said, I did this. I continued to do my work, and I did not have any role to play in the planning of the military or any other kind of administrative affairs during the revolt. So I was not kind of complicit in this revolt. I continued to write my poetry, and the reason, I would have liked to have just sat at home and had no role to play here, but I couldn't do that, because a lot of people because everybody was under suspicion. And he talks about his friend Hakim Hasanullah Khan, and he says that Hakim Hasanullah Khan was attacked because people suspected him that he was sympathetic to the British. So he says that if I was afraid that if I also stayed away from the court or tried to show any displeasure or disinclination, I might be under attack as well. So he says that I continue to do my job quietly. And then, of course, what happens is in mid September, the British come back and reconquer the city. Now, then starts a really difficult time for the whole city and for Ghalib too, because this is a conquering force. A lot of the soldiers, of course, leave after a while. Once they know that this particular stronghold of theirs, which was Delhi, is lost, they go away. They go away. They leave to try and carry on the fight in other places. The people of the city are left high and dry, and the British start, of course, killing. And a lot of the people who are afraid of that, they start leaving the city. They leave the city. Now, Ghalib at that point does not leave the city, and most of the people left the city. And the reason that he does not leave is that, which he also says, that he used to live in Balli Marang. Incidentally, he did not live in the house that we now know as Ghalib's Haveli. It was not that house. He moved into that house a few years after the revolt. But he was living not very far from there in a house which belonged to one of the Hakims of Balli Marang. The Hakims of Balli Marang were very well known, the Sharif Khani family. And one of those, and the Sharif Khani, the older members of the family, were the Hakims of the Maharaja of Patiala. And the Patiala Maharaja was in this particular fight on the side of the British. And because he was on the side of the British, he had this whole agreement with the Hakims that their property would be secure. And as soon as the city was conquered, his own soldiers would come and they would guard that lane in Balli Mara so that their property and their people would be safe. So Ghalib, who was living in he was living in rented accommodation, and that house belonged to one of the Hakims of that family, he was safe. But safe does not mean that he was comfortable, because there was violence going on all around them, and they were so scared that this lane was a cul-de-sac. At one end it was closed, and the other end, which was open, they bricked it up. They bricked it up, closed it, and they said that there wasn't even a well inside. So it was a great hardship for a few days, but they managed to keep themselves safe. And of course, there's no chance of going out. For 4 days they were closed, and then they said when they opened up after 4 days, when the Maharaja of Patiala's troops actually came in and said that, okay, now you're safe, you can come out, even then they could not go very far, because in the rest of the city it was chaos. So they could not go out. So they said that they managed to get some water, and they were like half dead. They managed to go and get some water, which was also very brackish, because the wells with sweet water were a little far, so they couldn't go that far. And they said they had a huge problem procuring food, and it was a time of huge hardship. And there were a lot of them there, because it was not only Ghalib, it was Ghalib's wife. Ghalib, in his old age, had adopted two children who were distantly related to him. And these small boys who used to call Ghalib and his wife Dada and Dadi. They also used to live with them. There were servants. There were two or three ladies. There was his Daroga, Kalyan, and there was Kallu, there was Ayaz. So all Madari's family. So he said there were about 20 people living there in his household. So it was a huge strain on him to try and see how to survive this period. Anyhow, they did survive, but the troubles were not over, because now Ghalib writes, and incidentally, he writes about the violence that they suffered, and to be fair to him, he talks about the violence that was perpetrated by the British soldiers, and the killing, and in fact, the killing was also somewhat discriminatory, because it was Muslims in particular who were targeted. And the reasons for that also are complex. This is not the place to really go into them. But what happened was that it was a targeted revenge which the British were taking on the Muslims. And as I said, a lot of the people had left when the British army entered, those who had not left had been thrown out by the British. So they threw all the inhabitants out, again excepting this particular area of Ballimara where these people, the Sharif Khani family and their tenants, etc., were living. And they, of course, that was the aim of that throwing out was to then proceed to loot the city. So they looted the city too. And Ghalib then, and after a while, what the other thing that happens is that you have, once the British have conquered the city, then they impose a martial law. They impose a martial law. There has been a lot of indiscriminate looting. After that, there is systematic looting because prize agents are appointed to go and confiscate, to look for treasure, and whatever they find, they keep. It's only later that they start to accept some people's, and they are not looking to, who's innocent and who's not. They are indiscriminately looting. So it becomes the suffering of the city is immense, and Ghalib reports all of this, and he says that he was, he's an old man by now. He's nearly 60 years old, and he has this huge family to support, and he doesn't know who to turn to. And at that point, he has these some of his Hindu friends whom he again mentions in his diary Dastambu, and he talks about how they have helped him, so many of them. And one of the people he names is actually one of them he names, which is his is somebody called Mahesh Das. Now Mahesh Das is the guy who supplies him. He's a merchant, but he also supplies him liquor. That was alcohol was a huge problem for Ghalib at that point because he was used to drinking. He is used to drinking imported liquor, and he's used to drinking imported liquor. And at that point, it's not available. So as soon as he can, he tries to get some there, and the only person, and Mahesh Das obliges him. So in fact, he writes in Dastambu, which is an official diary, that I'm very grateful to Mahesh Das who has supplied me this liquor. So Ghalib, of course, like everybody else, is under suspicion because everybody's under a cloud. People think that anybody who lived in the city during the revolt could be complicit in the revolt. And particularly if you're Muslim, the onus is on you to prove your innocence. And he, of course, says all this that he says in his diary. And but it takes a very long time. Now, the problem is that while he is under suspicion, his pension gets discontinued. Of course, the emperor is gone, so any source of income from the fort is now non-existent. The person who comes, so some of his friends who are in other parts of the country, they help out by sending him some money. I'm sure his friends whom he mentions who were in the city, and because they were Hindu, they were not persecuted to that extent, must have helped him out. But he also then begins to get some help from the Nawab of Rampur, who had been his shagird when he used to live in Delhi earlier in his youth. So once he succeeds to the throne, he moves to Rampur, and he starts to send him some money. So his condition improves, but he has to fight very hard to get his pension back. He keeps petitioning. He writes a qasida, an ode to the Governor General. He writes an ode to Malika Victoria, who has now been declared to be the empress, or rather not the empress at this stage. Empress comes later, that title comes later, but it has been announced that the British crown has not now taken over the territories of India from the East India Company. And Ghalib then talks about trying to win the British over, and his letters are full of these efforts. And finally those efforts do bear fruit, because by sort of mid 1860 or so, he manages to get his pension back. They have decided that he was not really responsible for he was not responsible for any of the violence or even actively supporting the revolt. So he gets his pension back. A few years later, in 1866, he also gets his khilat back. That is a big honor for him, and he writes of that with a great amount of pride, that I am now accepted in the darbar, now I get the khilat and all that. So he is really, really very happy about that. One of the things that he mourns the loss of is, I mean, he loses a lot of. I mean, he says that a lot of the jewelry which was in the house was lost in a very interesting manner. His wife, as the revolt had broken out in the city, she said to, in order to keep the jewels safe, I will move it into Kale Sahab's house. So she goes and moves the jewels and other valuables into Kale Sahab's house. And ironically, Kale Sahab's house is looted, whereas their own house is saved. So that jewelry is lost to no avail. I mean, it's lost. So he has these losses, of course. His another personal loss is that his brother, Yusuf Khan, who had mental health issues. He was mentally unstable had been for a very, very long time. He dies during the period when the city is really going through the worst of its of the violence, and they really can't do very much about it. And they then dig up a plot of land in a nearby masjid, and he used to live not very far from there also, and they bury him there. So it's this personal loss. He also he mourns the loss of many, many of his friends, because so many were there were people who were killed. Imam Baksh Sehbai, for instance, is killed. His own some of his friends are imprisoned. There is, for instance, Shifta, Mustafa Khan Shifta, a close friend of his. He is imprisoned. Another person he had, contemporary Fazle Haq Khairawadi, he is exiled to the Andamans. He has all these losses, and of course there are countless who have died, who have been killed, and on both sides, because the British were initially killed when the soldiers came in and the outbreak first happened, and then when the British reconquer the city, many people are killed then, and many are executed once the trials start. So a lot of friends are lost. And I would like to close by just reading one aspect of, or rather, let me second last. So penultimate point is, Ghalib also talks about the demolitions that take place, because a huge amount of land between the Red Fort and the Jama Masjid, which was dense with bazaars and buildings and all is demolished. And he comments on that, and he says that it is amazing that all these bazaars and those houses have disappeared. The owners themselves today will not be able to point out that where my shop used to be or where my house used to be. They can't say, because it's all gone. All these wonderful big buildings, and he talks about the Akbarabadi Masjid, etc., they have all been demolished. But then he also says कि ये सब गिर रहा है, but why should I not celebrate? I mean, मैं ये बिल्डिंग्स लेके क्या करूंगा इनको, जब लोग ही नहीं रहे तो क्या मैं चूल्हे में डालूंगा इनको? And which means that he says that, okay, the buildings are going, but it's the people who have gone also. And if the people have gone, what will I do with these? What will we do with these buildings anyway? What will we do when the people have gone? And his greatest regret is for the people who have gone. And this is how he really puts it. Sorry, I will just take a while to. I'm sorry, I don't know what I've done with it. Let me just at least read out the translation. Translation is right here. Let no one imagine that I die from the sorrow of my own gloom and destruction. Of the English who were slaughtered by those black-faced, black-hearted men, one was my refuge, one my patron, one my friend, and one my disciple in poetry. Of the Indians, there were some dear ones, some friends, some disciples in poetry, some beloveds. All have turned to dust. The grief of just one dear one is so hard to bear. How hard must be the life of one who has to bear the bereavement of so many dear ones? Alas, so many friends have died that when I die, there will be no one left to mourn me. I will try and locate this, but really now this brings to an end. Yeah, okay, fine, I found it. This is what happens, Kate. He says, ये कोई ना समझे कि मैं अपनी बेरौनकी और तबाही के गम में मरता हूं। अंग्रेज कौम में जो इन रूसिया कालों के हाथ कत्ल हुए, उसमें कोई मेरा उम्मीदगार और कोई मेरा शफीक और कोई मेरा दोस्त, कोई मेरा यार, कोई मेरा शागिर्द। हिंदुस्तानियों में कुछ अजीज, कुछ दोस्त, कुछ शागिर्द, कुछ माशूक, सो वो सब के सब खाक में मिल गए. So this is what he says about what he has lost in the revolt. There is a lot to say about Ghalib, but that will wait another time. In the meanwhile, if there are any questions, please go ahead and I'll try and answer them. I will have a look at what might have been posted so far. Yes, Simin, I loved R.V. Smith's books too. Shahad Majid, thank you very much. Arun Bhardwaj, how can one get a translation? It's not Dastan Ko, it's Dastambu. And the translation, it's originally, by the way, it was written in an ancient Parsi. Ancient Parsi, which was before it, so it is Parsi without any Arabic words. That's a very interesting concept. So he writes it in this sort of very ancient form of Parsi. Dastambu, I have read it in Urdu translation. There have been English translations as well. Do a Google search, and if I find a link, I will post it to your comment in a bit. Thank you, everyone, for the positive comments and Kasida Kirti. Work of drudgery. That's an interesting one. There, Chandrasekhar is talking about where you can find a translation of Dastambu. Simin, I don't think, I mean, whenever you have these kind of revolutions, and you must realize that we talk about it as a war of independence, it is much more than that. It's also a sort of a social upheaval and a social revolution that is happening. Again, if you read Chandni Chowk, I have mentioned this a little bit in slightly more detail, and how and any kind of revolution like that does worry the established elite. They are status quoist. They don't want their positions of power and privilege to be challenged. So Dost Khan, I don't think he lived with Kale Sahab. He lived for a while in a house that was owned by Kale Sahab. Now, Kale Sahab had several properties all over. So it was in one of those houses, but right after he was released from prison in 1847, and obviously what happens, and it happens now also, he came out from prison and immediately his landlord said, "Bhai, khali karo ghar. We don't want a convicted criminal living in our house." So he was asked by his landlord to vacate, and who would give him place? So Kale Sahab obliged him by saying, "You can stay in my in this house which I own," and he went and stayed in that house. But after a while, Kale Sahab also needed that property, so then he moved into one of the houses where he was when the revolt broke out. And after a few years after that, that house again was sold, so he had to move out again. He moved a lot because he lived in rented accommodation, as happens, obviously. Yes. Dilli ki hasti, yes, 5 hangamon par. Bilkul. And it's amazing that he talks about, I've been talking about the melas and tyohar and all that. A lot of what he talks about is really these things. He talks about Phul Walon ki Sair, he talks about Chandni Chowk, he talks about the Yamuna ke pul ka ki sair, those are the kind of things he talks about, and much of it is about going out and having fun. See, I think yes, emotional well-being definitely was affected, and you feel. Uh, uh, Ghalib was a very, very resilient person. As an individual, he's a very resilient person. So I think he copes very well. But obviously, a lot of people were not only destitute and subject of violence and looting and all that, but they would have been traumatized by this. So no doubt about that. Uh, he talks about Dost Khan. He does talk about his brother Yusuf's death, and he does talk about how devastated he was and how helpless he felt. How the fact that he could not even go uh, and do a proper funeral or anything, and it's just a few people went and managed somehow to get the wherewithal to have him given a burial, as I said, in in the compound of a mosque. So thank you, everybody. Which foreign liquor was he used to drinking? He used to drink gin called Old Tom and something called Castilian. Now, this is Castilian wine or is it some kind of spirit? I'm not very sure, but this is what is mentioned in his letters. Very soon after, he had also discovered liqueurs, and he loved liqueurs because he really liked sweet things. So his love for mangoes is very uh, well known. So he loved sweet things, and liqueurs were something that he really, really appreciated. Can we have at least one more session on Dastambu? I think you can just go ahead and read it now. Um, uh, Dia, I don't think Ghalib mocking British rule. I don't. I think he, of course, was critical of specific policies. He's critical of specific policies. He's particularly after the 1857, when Delhi comes under martial law, he is very critical of this martial law, which is like an emergency where all regular rule of law, etc., is all suspended. And he expresses great discontent with that. But at the same time, I don't think he questions British rule or the validity of British rule. And to that extent, he's very much, I think, a product of his times. I mean, we should not project back in time our own nationalist ideas. Nationalism in that form is still to come, and I think we shouldn't judge him on that. He was just doing what a lot of other people in his place actually did. So yeah, that's the answer. Gurpreet, Chandrasekhar has talked about the English translation of the Dastambu in which is on Francis Pritchard's website, I think. What happened? Ah, yeah. Dia, that's a very good question. I forgot to mention this. Now, what happened? All the people who were thrown out of Delhi, initially everybody was thrown out because the British just wanted to give the soldiers ample time to loot. Uh, Apart from any other thing, it was also security. But after all that happened, after a few months, then a lot of the Hindus and Jains were allowed to come back. And they came back. The Muslims were still kept out. And the Muslims were actually not allowed to come back to their homes, and those who actually had homes, because a lot of them had actually been confiscated, but those who had homes even were not allowed to come back and occupy those homes till more than 2 years later. So it was only in November 1859 that everybody was allowed to come back. So a lot of Muslims came back, But they came back often to empty houses. Everything in their houses had been looted. Many of them had even gone away because, what happened initially when they were thrown out. They went and somebody took shelter in maybe the Dargah of Nizamuddin, or in the nearby Arab Sarai, or some of them even just camped out in the, Delhi then as now is strewn with a lot of old tombs and abandoned mosques, etc., right? And they just went and took shelter over there. But how long can you keep taking shelter? You have to go and start building your life. So once they realized that they were not going to be allowed back in a hurry, many of them tried to go and make livings elsewhere. A lot of the Delhi intelligentsia, for instance, moved on, and they went on to Lahore. So um, you have Altaf Hussain Hali, who had been educated in Delhi, though he was from Panipat. He went on eventually to Lahore. Muhammad Hussain Azad, who was the Shagird of Zauq, he moved on to Lahore. So a lot of people just left and made their lives elsewhere. Yes, this is part of that. Uh, I am not, yeah, I mean, the whole argument, though not such a, not precisely this, but a lot of this is in the book also. The book, of course, has a much longer scope. So, though it ends with the revolt, it goes on from the beginning of the 19th century. Uh, Partho, yes, he does write about the killing of the descendants of Bahadur Shah Zafar. He talks about this. He said that they were killed. He talks about, but he writes, I mean, he does not write in as if he's narrating that this happened and this happened and this happened. As I said, when he's writing, particularly when he's writing Dastambu, he cannot. He's not very he can't be very forthright and say that this is absolute injustice and why have you done. In fact, he keeps talking about British violence as the justice which is meted out to a rebellious people. So really that's the tone of Dastambu. In his letters he's a little bit more unguarded, and of course the time when the execution of these princes took place, he was not writing any letters at that point. There was just too much violence and there was no postal service. But at a later period, when he talks about Bahadur Shah Zafar also, he writes it very dispassionately. He does not, there's not a lot of emotion in what he says about Bahadur Shah Zafar. And when he writes a small, really two-line elegy to him when he hears that he has died in Rangoon. He says that that Zafar is now finally freed from the bonds of the British and the bonds of the flesh. So he just mentions that he has died, and he just leaves it at this. He just writes this. So it's a very, very brief elegy. Um, it becomes difficult, as I said, for people to sometimes talk about this. Did his children, Rakesh? Yes, his own children, he had 7 children, but all of them died in infancy. And that's why it was very late in life that he, in his 50s, that he adopted these two children. Um, Ghalib with French wine. Yeah, I mean, he talks about, I, one time when he talks about French wine is really champagne. So after this is maybe a little while after the revolt, and he says in one of his letters that his friend has of course asked him, knowing that he's so alcohol means a lot to him. He says, "What have you been doing with alcohol?" Obviously, that's been a question which his friend has asked, and he replies that uh, that uh, all these French champagne. I mean, if you want, even French champagne is available in Delhi, but I don't have the means to buy it. I don't have any money. And so where am I going? You don't think that I'm going to be buying it. He was very, very, by the way, he was very unhappy with the desi liquor that he used to have. He said that this doesn't agree with me. It makes me ill. But what to do? If I had any choice, I would not drink it. But I have to. So thank you. Vikas, are we moving towards martial law? Oh God, I hope not. But what happens is during, I think, times of uncertainty and difficult times like this, whether it's natural disasters, whether there are epidemics, whether there's revolutions, what we call human rights, what we call basic freedoms, they do get infringed. And that is a very valid and important question to answer. Where do we draw the line? How much power should governments have to how far can they go in the interests of public good, and where they need to draw the line? So that is a very interesting question. I mean, I certainly Adil, a very interesting question. Why did they target the Muslims? According to me, and this is my opinion, and I'm writing about it in my book, which is going to be published sometime, hopefully. We don't know, these days nothing is clear, but I feel that they really saw this as the final nail in the coffin of the Mughal dynasty. Even in the years leading up to the revolt, they had been trying very hard to try and reduce the Mughal emperor and his family as much as possible. And it had been decided that after Bahadur Shah dies, there will be no more this whole the title of king, the title of Badshah, everything would go. The Mughals would be moved out of the Red Fort. The family would be moved out, and they would start reducing the pension and all that. They would reduce the pension and all that. So they wanted to really cut down, because at one level they understood that the Mughals, even at such a late stage in the 1850s, has that sort of a popular appeal that the British, really try as they might, they could not supplant that. And therefore they wanted to get rid of him. Now, once the revolt broke out, if you look at some of the secret correspondence, one major thing of the British was they said, now we can use this to finally say the Mughal emperor and Mughal family should be just finished off once and for all. And and if you look at the trial and how the trial was conducted, because Bahadur Shah was tried in a court, in a military court, which was ironically held in the Diwan-e-Khas. And he says that, and if you read those papers, and if you read the other correspondence also, they made this whole thing about a Muslim conspiracy. A Muslim conspiracy led by the emperor, who is the emperor of the Muslims, the leader of the Muslims. Now, that's a huge misunderstanding, deliberate maybe, of the role of the Mughal emperor. The Mughal emperor did not, Bahadur Shah or Akbar II or whatever, did not see himself as a leader of the Muslims. And certainly the revolt of 1857 was not a revolt of the Muslims. It had huge participation from all communities. So that was clearly wrong. But it gave them a very good handle to discredit Bahadur Shah as a leader of the Muslims. And then, therefore, again, from that logic, they had to then show that, yes, we are dealing with these seditious Muslims who are doing this. Now, what happened was, another thing that happened after that, it became a habit, because it worked so well in dividing the people also, that then the British realized that this was a very good long-term policy. And that goes into very different territory later. That's another story. See, I mean, 1857 was very violent. It was also very violently suppressed. And so that kind of, and it was so violently suppressed that for a long time there was this huge silence. And from the Indian, we keep talking that there have been no Indian histories of the revolt. I mean, think about it. How will they write the history? They are scared to even talk. Ghalib himself in his letters says at some point that there is a lot to say, but I can't say it. I'm scared to say anything. So therefore, it's just such a violent episode that people now realize that violent rebellion has a huge price if it fails. So it doesn't. by and large, it doesn't happen. And that's where, and when you have the national movement grow, it initially begins as sort of constitutional, the struggle for constitutional reform, which begins with the founding of the Congress and all that. But very soon, when Gandhi takes charge of a lot of leadership, and particularly a sort of strategy. I remember, in my college class, I particularly remember Professor Bipan Chandra, who used to explain this so well, that the whole idea of non-violent struggle is because it gives a lot of flexibility and power to the struggling people, because they can never really overthrow a powerful political colonizing force by the use of arms. They're just, their very powerlessness makes them very vulnerable. So any attempt to do that is very vulnerable. So that's why non-violence itself becomes such an important weapon in this in the anti-colonial struggle. But again, very complex. That's a very simplistic reduction of a very complex explanation. Sorry if for doing that, but again, so come to an end here, and thank you everybody for listening in. If you want to continue to share, see this, if you've missed any bits of the start of this, I'm going to save it so you can watch it on your timeline later. Thank you again, and look forward to speaking to you again. Thank you.